Hello and welcome to the Food Connections podcast, the podcast that connects you with the food you eat. I'm Dr. Laura Wyness, a registered nutritionist and one of Scotland's regional food tourism ambassadors. I'm interested in all things related to food and nutrition, and I love learning more about the food we eat, how it's made, and getting to know the people involved in making our food. This episode focuses on Scottish deer and venison, and I'm delighted to speak with one of the most knowledgeable individuals on this topic, Nichola Fletcher. Nichola was born in Glasgow and trained at Edinburgh College of Art, where she won some awards and a travelling scholarship, and she is still a practising goldsmith. She then moved to Fife with her husband John, who started Europe's first commercial deer farm. This started her involvement with venison. She was a very early pioneer of providing venison via mail order and farmers' markets. Teaching people how to butcher, prepare and cook venison has been her life's work, for which she was awarded an MBE in 2014. Nichola has written 10 books, 5 about venison and game, with the rest including caviar, oatmeal and all aspects of meat. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as Nichola explains how deer are farmed, the difference between wild and farmed venison, and some really great tips for cooking venison. Welcome to the podcast, Nichola Fletcher. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure.
Can we kick off with a little bit of background to you and what your involvement is in deer farming and venison as a food?
Yes, okay. Well, I come from Glasgow originally, was brought up there, and after I left school, I went to art college. So nothing whatsoever to do with the countryside or deer or anything at all. And there I trained to be a goldsmith and also a hot glass blower. But it was while I was there that I met the person that was to become my husband, John Fletcher, and he was studying wild deer on the island of Rum. And he was actually studying something very interesting, which was the hormones that affect the behavior of the animals and also the way their antlers grow. And they came up with some really interesting information about hormones, both in people and in animals, which has proved to be of huge scientific and medical interest ever since. So while doing that, he just became fascinated in the deer themselves. And as part of this study group, they had some, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 deer in a little enclosure of maybe 40, 50 acres, something like that, 20 hectares. And they were feeding them and studying them, and the deer bred and produced young and that sort of thing. And it occurred to him that there wasn't a tremendous amount of difference between that and what people were doing with cattle and sheep on the uplands. And this was in the very early 70s. So the original Coma report had come out, which is the one that started off the whole trend for people to reduce their fat intake, and particularly animal fat intake. And it was deemed that you shouldn't really eat too much because it would make your cholesterol go too high and risk of heart attacks and strokes and so on and so forth. So the agricultural industry, the livestock industry, was looking at ways to try and make cattle and sheep leaner, and mostly they used sort of steroids and antibiotics and things like that. And we sort of thought, from having looked at the venison that we were eating, well, here is a meat that's actually lean anyway. You don't need to give it anything artificial. It just is. And if you combine that with the notion that deer are quite happy to be living in an enclosure, bingo, you've got deer farming, really. So John, who had trained originally as a vet, decided he didn't really want to go on with live animal research. And so he thought, well, why don't we just try and produce meat instead? I think another element at the time was, and again, it's sort of difficult to look back to the early 70s and the way that livestock was handled and treated, not all the time, but quite commonly, which was with little understanding of the animal's natural behavior. And if the animal didn't do what you wanted to do, you had to overcome this. But having studied these deer in their natural habitat, because they were studying the ones outside the little enclosure as well, and learning what they like to do and when, it seemed to John that you could produce a sort of livestock farming that worked with the animal instead of fighting against it all the time. And such simple things as the placing of a gate, for example, if deer like to traditionally drift uphill, well, put the gate at the top of the field instead of the bottom. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's little things like that that just make all the difference to an animal doing something naturally and peacefully and willingly. So, for example, we've never used dogs to round them up. We just open a gate and lead them through it like the Pied Piper because they want to follow us, which seems to me a lot less stressful for everybody. So in the sort of great enthusiasm and possibly naivety of youth, we bought this little tiny farm just outside Auchtermuchty and started Europe's first deer farm. And I've said this for about 50 years and nobody's come up and said, we did it first. So I think we probably were. We're certainly the first one in Britain anyway. And that's the first commercial deer farm. In other words, one that's producing meat for sale to the public. And of course, most people thought we were completely nutty sort of hippies and going for the good life. And there was probably an element of that in there. But nevertheless, we really, really wanted to try and produce meat that was humanely produced, that didn't have to use all these antibiotics and chemicals and, artificial this, that, and the next thing. And we just wanted to see if it would work. And basically it did. It grew and it grew. We started off very early days, sort of in the mid-80s, doing a mail order service, which in those days, mail order was mainly for things like bedroom slippers, and it would say, allow 28 days for delivery and things like that on the order form. And so we were really quite pioneering in trying to get this meat down to people overnight and in good condition. I mean, everybody's used to this now. You just pick up your phone, you press a few buttons and something arrives, but it wasn't like that in those days. So we had to train both the couriers, the carrier people who were delivering it, and we also had to train the customers not to go out when their delivery was expected. Otherwise you had disaster. So it was a kind of double training session. So there was a lot of stress to begin with, and especially around Christmas time when things got busy. And I learned to sort of dread evening phone calls and things like that. But again, it was all a matter of working things out. And so we ended up with a very successful little micro business, I would call it, a family business, which we called Fletchers of Auchtermuchty, which had quite a good ring to it. Fletchers of Auchtermuchty, seriously good venison. That was our strap line. And we went round the game fairs, the Highland Show and farmers markets and all these sort of things. And the great thing about selling it that way was that you were dealing directly with the customer. So you could answer all their questions and you could teach them how to cook it, how to store it, everything about it, instead of just sending it off to some supermarket who maybe doesn't give the same advice that I would have given.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you've, as you say, been pioneers in the deer farming. What, just out of interest, what other countries do deer farming? You said you're first in Europe, but where else does deer farming?
In the 60s, the Rowett Research Institute started an experimental deer farm, and they thought that it might be the answer to sheep farming, which really wasn't very profitable, still isn't if you take away the subsidies. And so they started this experimental farm. And in fact, John supplied some of the deer from Rum, this was. And so although I say we were the first deer farm, we were the first commercial deer farm, to be completely correct. And at the same time, in New Zealand, they were starting to farm deer. They were starting to catch deer in the wild, which had become a pest, basically, because they were an introduced species from Britain, and they were rampaging through all the wild trees and wildlife in New Zealand and creating havoc. So they were being shot from helicopters and in fairly brutal ways, I think. And it was discovered that there was a good market for their hides and for their velvet antlers, which is the antlers when they're growing. The deer are quite unique in livestock in that they produce their antlers every year. The antlers grow and then they drop off, and then in the spring a new set appears. And while it's growing, it has this lovely velvety covering, which is very beautiful. And in the Far East, Chinese traditional medicine, this is highly valued. So the New Zealanders started shooting the deer, lopping off the antlers and making a pretty penny. And then it occurred to some people that it might be rather easier just to dart the deer, stick them in a field and feed them up and get even better ones. So that's how the deer industry started in New Zealand, predominantly to produce velvet antler. And then, of course, the meat came along later. And that's a much bigger industry in New Zealand and has always been, probably will remain so, than the deer farming industry in Britain. Because when John, he'd gone out to New Zealand several times and seen this in practice, and he had a feeling that the British public would not accept that, chopping and things off live animals like that. And so he was instrumental in making quite sure that it was banned in Britain, because he felt that if people associated deer farming with that, then they wouldn't touch the meat. And what we were interested in was selling really good meat. So, and that got taken up in most European countries, I think, as well. So that became a Europe-wide practice, or non-practice, I should say. So that's the main difference between New Zealand farming and European farming. It has to be said, though, that New Zealanders have made a tremendously professional job of farming deer, and they produce incredibly high quality meat, which is they export all over the world, including to Britain, but also to the Far East and America places. And their industry is much, much bigger, despite New Zealand being a comparatively small country.
And so in Scotland, being a smaller country, what does the industry look like here in terms of deer farming? And is it, just to clarify, is it roe deer you're talking about, or red deer, or what's the main breed of deer that's farmed?
That's a really good question. And they're actually not breeds, they're actually different species.
Okay.
So a roe deer would not be able to cross with a red deer, like a different breed of cattle. You can cross those. But with the deer, they're actually different species. They've got different Latin names and all the rest of it. So roe deer are the little tiny ones that you see bounding around in the hedges and into the trees and things. And those are not farmed. One of the principal reasons for that is, A, they are quite small and quite jumpy, but B, their natural way of living is in small family groups. So that's why you tend to just see, 4 or 5 or 6 roe deer. You never see 100 of them together. And so that's their natural way of living. So if you wanted to farm them, you'd have to have masses and masses of little paddocks with a family group in each one, glaring at the ones in the next paddock and wanting to fight. So it wouldn't work. It goes back to us working with the way the animals like to be. There are also a few in Scotland fallow deer, though they're not very common. Fallow deer were mainly introductions into deer parks. So there are a few wild populations of those in Scotland, but I think we can probably almost forget about those for the time being. And the main species of deer that's in Scotland is the red deer, which is the one like the monarch of the Glen Landseer painting, with the great big antlers and very stately, quite a large animal with a beautiful chestnut coat. And red deer like to live in herds. That's their natural instinct. They don't like being on their own. They like to be with a group of other red deer. And also, as John discovered when he was studying the deer on Rum, in the summertime in particular, the male stags tend to stay in a little bachelor group, and the females, the hinds, go off and have their calves and look after the calves and raise their calves. And they only really mainly come together during the rutting season, which is the mating season, which is in the autumn. So that means it's quite easy to manage them, again, working with their natural behavior. So we tend to keep the hinds and calves separate from the stags, except at the mating season. So yes, so all the deer that are farmed in Scotland are red deer. Yeah, in England it's a little bit different, but it's red deer up here. Plus, I think, again, the red deer being bigger, the carcass is probably 4 times the size of a roe deer carcass, means that the cuts that you get out of it are bigger and probably more suited to people who are selling to the multiples and supermarkets, who tend to want a more kind of standard sized product in their packages.
Have you seen quite a big change in terms of deer farming over the years? Has it increased in numbers in Scotland in the terms of the numbers of farmers doing deer farming, or how's that evolved?
Well, it seems to have gone in cycles. There was a tremendous boom in the sort of 80s and 90s, and lots of people went into it. To begin with, everybody did everything, but then it sort of tended to go slightly in the way of conventional livestock, in that people up in the hills would produce calves which would be sold to people down on the better grass, who would then finish them off, grow them on and finish them for venison, which is sort of what happens with cattle and sheep. The ones in the hills are mainly sort of breeding herds, and they sell on to a finisher to finish the animals for meat production. So that was happening. There were one or two people who did like us and shot their deer on the farm and had little meat processing units. So that was very nice. And some of those are still going, and some of them have started up. There was a marketing group formed, and some of the Scottish deer farmers have joined this in. There's a little sort of cluster of deer farmers down in the Borders who are tremendously professional farmers, livestock farmers, and they've all gone into deer as well and doing a very, very, very professional job. But they're not selling their own meat, they're selling them down to, there's a specified dedicated abattoir in Yorkshire which cuts and processes the deer for people like Waitrose and Marks and Spencers. And when I say the deer go to Yorkshire, it's if the deer have been farmed and properly managed and they're quiet and calm and they're used to being handled and trotting through gates and this sort of thing, they actually travel remarkably well, on semi-long distance haulage, say from the Borders to Yorkshire. I don't know how many hours that would be, maybe 3 hours or something. But as long as they're properly loaded and it's all done nice and calmly, then, that system does work just as well as it does for any other animal. So I think people have this image of deer as being the sort of iconic wild Scottish animal, and I think quite a lot of this goes right back to sort of pagan times, and when people attributed animals with all sorts of qualities. Because I do remember when we first started farming deer and having some that were really so tame they could come and eat out of your hand, and they still do. We've got one that comes and bangs his nose against John's office window and asks for apples and titbits and things. But some people got quite profoundly upset about this notion that this noble wild beast was actually just like any other animal. Basically, it wants food and sex and somewhere to shelter. That's about it. And, and we were giving them food. And on this little farm where when we arrived, there were about 5 trees on the whole farm. We now have every paddock has got huge hedges which have got trees, mature trees in them now, all the way around the farms, which is, it's great wildlife corridors, but it also gives a lot of shelter for the deer. So we give them shelter and we give them food and we give them some ladies in the autumn to have fun with.
So it sounds like a very sustainable way of farming then, if it's for the environment that they're in.
It is. And interestingly, talking about the environment, at the moment, as you may know, the Scottish government is still trying to sort of work out how it deals with agricultural support in the future. And ever since we started in the 1973, successive ministers have told us, livestock support, this agricultural support is going to disappear, so that we won't bother starting you off with the deer because it's going to go. Well, we were stupid enough to believe them for ages. And right now, John is going to various meetings because it looks as though they're turning the clock right back, and they're giving loads of money to cattle and sheep farmers, who are the biggest producers of carbon dioxide and methane, other than perhaps, chicken and pork farming, which is not great either. And they're thinking that they just won't bother with the deer again. And yet, deer farming, if you're going to farm animals for meat, is a lower carbon way of farming livestock for meat than either cattle or sheep.
So is deer farming, would you say, is it quite an easy way to farm? It's fairly simplistic because there's not a lot of intervention, and the deer are just left as much as possible in their natural environment. And I take it there's busy times of the year for a deer farmer.
Yes, I think I can compare it to other forms of farming. We don't have to sort of bring them into sheds for, like sheep do for lambing and things all through the winter. Is always quite a big deal for sheep farmers. So we tend to just leave them outside and let them get on with it for the calving, and that seems to work very well. Obviously, we have to go and feed them throughout the winter. That's the same as everybody else. And during the rut, the mating, yes, we just put the stags in and again let them get
leave
on
them
with
to
it.
Yeah.
Leave them to it. So yes, I suppose in terms of sort of things that you have to do, it is fairly easy. I suppose I haven't done any other kind of farming, so I haven't got any personal experience to compare that with.
And then what's the difference between a farming deer and the wild venison? So farmed venison and wild venison production.
Well, that's the big question. So it's slightly different situation in England to Scotland, because in England there are a lot of deer parks, which are kind of halfway between wild and farmed. They also have vast numbers now of fallow deer, which were the ones in between size to the red and the roe deer. In Scotland, we have deer farms. And we also have the wild deer industry, which is the traditional one that's been going on since men first had guns, I suppose, and before that. So I would say from the consumer's point of view, the main thing to bear in mind as the difference between wild venison and farm venison is that farm venison's only point is to produce really good quality meat from young animals that are going to be consistent and tender and the same every time. That's what deer farming is for. Wild venison is a byproduct. So people don't go out into the hills to say, right, we're going to stalk some venison and we're going to get the really best bit so that Mrs. Bloggs can have the finest little piece of venison. Because really the finest venison is, like all animals, is coming from the younger ones. So, I mean, when we shoot them on the farm, our age range would be from about 14 months up to just over 2 years. And we definitely wouldn't take anything over 2.5 years. So an animal that age in the wild hasn't even started to grow his antlers barely, or if he has, he's just got little spikes like that. Mm-hmm. And so recreational stalking, which is what brings a lot of income to Scotland, and it shouldn't be despised at all, brings in a huge amount of income. But this is recreational stalking. So people are going out there because they want a stag with antlers. It doesn't necessarily have to be ridiculously big, but they want a stag with antlers, and they want the experience of climbing up the hills and going out with the stalker and being guided. When that happens, they're a long way away from the animal when they're shooting it, inevitably, because you just can't get that close. And the animal doesn't always, or in fact, usually, the animal doesn't just drop dead like that. It usually runs a little bit and then drops dead. Or sometimes it has to be followed up because it doesn't drop dead and it's just wounded. So during that time, there is a lot of adrenaline going on in that poor animal's body until it is dead. And that alters the pH of the meat, and it alters the whole way the meat matures. So that's one element of it. The second thing, as I said earlier, is the age of the animal. So those animals will be 6, 7, 8 years old, if not older. So they're coming into the tougher category. And possibly even more so with hinds, because they tend to shoot out hinds, which is more of a way of population control. So that's the other reason for shooting deer in Scotland, is to control the numbers, because as we've all heard, it's necessary to do that to allow tree regeneration and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So the deer have to be culled to reduce the numbers. And in many cases, they have to do this, well, they've got to kill a lot of them at once. And again, the quality of the meat isn't the top priority. So all this venison is very, very variable. I mean, they might be shooting calves as well. So you might have something that actually is like veal, I suppose, which would be very, very good. But on the other hand, you might have a 10-year-old rutting stag who would be stinky and smelly and tough and, and everything in between. So it's very, very difficult to produce something that somebody's going to buy one day and enjoy, and then think, well, I like that, I'll get it again. And then they find there's something totally different with it, and they think, what did I do wrong? And they always blame themselves, and it's not themselves to blame. So it has to be said that things have got a lot better with wild venison. And I spent a number of years working with what was first the Red Deer Commission and then turned into Scotland's Natural Heritage, SNH, and is now called Nature Scot. And we went round doing best practice days with the estates and the stalkers. And they were really interesting and really good. So they would start off with taking them out in the hill, and they were talking about stalking them and identifying them and all this sort of thing. And then there would be a ballistics guy talking about how to use firearms and all this sort of thing. And then they would have them in the larder, and they would teach them the best ways of skinning them so that they're kept clean and all this kind of stuff. And my session came right at the end, which was a session with a butcher. And so the butcher was cutting it up, and I was showing people basically the effects of all the things they'd learned during the day, how that affects the meat that they're eating. Mm-hmm. So bruising, shot damage, age, which would make gristle. And I would show them why that matters. And I was also pointing out to them that although they're not thinking about this when they're taking a client up on the hill, they are primary food producers, which, most of them had never even considered that, because they just shoot the deer, take it to the larder, gutted, and off it goes to the game dealer, and they don't sort of hear about it anymore. So I think it was quite an eye-opener to some of those people, and I was explaining the various things that they could do to try and help and mitigate and get a better quality of meat. And I think as a result of those, which went on for a number of years, the stalkers have, they were really interested in it, actually, and much more interested than I expected them to be. But, I did actually make them, I would cook something with a bit of gristle left on, and the same bit with the gristle left on. I said, look, just eat it, don't take my word for it, because I'm just a stupid woman, you're clever stalkers. And so they would eat it, and I'd say, oh yeah. And I would cook casseroles in different ways using young venison, old venison, really smelly, horrible venison, and then the three things having been marinated, and asked them, we just did a kind of vox pop thing as which one they liked the best and things. And it was really interesting, and just getting them to think about all these things.
Yeah. Is that one of the kind of barriers for people not using venison, because they don't know what to do with it or how to cook it or what to look for? And I know you've done a lot of workshops and group sessions and cookery demonstrations and trying to educate and highlight to people just what to look for, how to cook it, how to prep it, the do's and don'ts. So would you say, is that one of the main barriers for people not choosing venison in the supermarket or buying venison?
Yes, I mean, I find it still a little bit disappointing that the poorer quality of wild venison is still being sold. I mean, personally, I would like to see all that poorer quality venison used for maybe pet food or something like that, for which there's huge demand as, really nice, healthy pet food. And only the really best stuff being put forward to the consumer. As I say, it's got hugely better, and it is much, much, much better than it used to be. But, and I'm not just saying this because we're farming deer, because I'm not even selling venison anymore, so I don't have any sort of commercial interest in that anymore. But it is just much better. And since we stopped having our own butchery thing, somebody gave us a fallow carcass a couple of years ago, which was, I don't know, about 6 years old. It wasn't awful, and it was quite nice. And then following that, we were asked to produce a carcass for the game fair at Scone. So there was an animal that was not much good, and he was about 5, I think. So we shot him and off he went to the game fair, and then we cut him up afterwards and stuck it in the freezer. And the venison was quite nice. But I did find that the steaks were very much more difficult to cook than our farm ones used to be. And I think this is a big difference between farmed and wild, or let's say young and old, is that when the animal gets older, when you're doing something like either a roast or a steak, doesn't apply to stews. Stew's a stew, you can do it with anything pretty much. But when you're doing a steak or a roast, I always recommend people to brown the outside of it very quickly, then partially cook it, whether it's a steak or a roast, then rest it. And that keeps the moisture in, because we're talking a very lean meat here with virtually no fat at all. But what I find with older venison, and so this is like the one that we did for the game fair that was 5, he was a farm animal. It's just he wasn't of the age we would normally have sold for meat. But when you cooked a steak there, it'd be a very, very short window between having it just perfect when you started to slice it, and then by the time it was on the plate and handed around, it had gone grey and all the moisture had come out of it. And it happened very, very, very quickly. Now, I think if you're a chef and you're doing that all the time, you'll know that split-second moment that you've got to get it on the plate and out just perfectly. If you're not a chef that's doing that all the time, it's very difficult. As I say, even I found it difficult. And then last year we had a little yearling stag who'd got in with the hinds, so I'm afraid he had to be shot out, and we chopped him up and shared some with my daughter Martha, Mm-hmm. Anyway, we shared it with her, and she came right back and she said, I had forgotten how good farm venison really is. It's amazing, isn't it? And because it had been quite a number of years since we'd had one like that. And she was right. I mean, the difference is really, really striking. And yet that 4 or 5 year old beast would have been counted an absolute prime one for a wild one because he was in good condition and all the rest. But he was just older. I was talking about this difficult point where the meat of older animals can go from undercooked to overcooked in the sort of split second. But even if you're doing just nice young farm venison, if you're doing a roast or a steak, and in particular a roast, I would always, always, always recommend people to use a meat thermometer. And you can buy a little meat thermometer, one of those little round one with a stick on the end, for about a tenner. And it just takes all the worry out of everything because, you can tell what temperature the internal temperature of the meat is. You can tell when to take it out and rest it. You can tell when it's resting how the temperature is creeping up.
Now, what temperature should that be, or is there a standard?
Well, no, I think it's got too many variables and too many taste variables to give a sort of definite. But I used to, for the sake of simplicity, again, if you were using one of these dial ones, which is like a clock face, mm-hmm. I used to say, take the roast out when the dial is pointing at sort of like 6:30, which is, I think, about 45, 50 degrees or something. And then you start resting it and you see the temperature just gradually creeping up so that you can stop it. And that happens nice and slowly compared to the roasting temperature, which could, because if you leave it in the hot oven, it gets there and it goes there and suddenly, it's up there before you know it.
So it's important to rest it for a while.
Rest it. And while it's resting, what happens is the meat in the middle's pretty much raw, and the meat on the outside is probably slightly overcooked, but while it's resting, the heat goes on to the middle and the moisture comes back to the outside. So you get this much more evenly pink rather than the sort of band around the edge and raw in the middle. And I think it's much nicer to eat when it's just evenly pink and then it's sort of soft and relaxed and much nicer.
So take out the oven and get your vegetables ready. And by the time you've done that and plated up the veg, then the venison should be ready.
Pretty much, yeah. Up. I mean, it depends. It depends on the size of the joint. If it's a roast, because it will take, obviously a big one will take a bit longer, but it usually takes roughly the same size, roughly the same time to get to the 6:30 as it does. So if it's taken 20 minutes to get there, you might have to wait another 15, 20 for it to come up to the right temperature. But if it's just a tiny little bit and it's only taken 5 minutes, then you've got to act quick.
Exactly. And so as a consumer, where would you recommend getting venison from? Is it supermarkets? Is it a butcher? Is it from straight from the farm type of place? Or
well, if you can get it directly from the producer, from the farm, I would go for that. There are some farmers markets that have farm venison. Not all the venison at the farmers markets, despite the name, is farm venison. So just beware which ones you're getting. And yes, mail order for people who are doing mail order. The supermarkets, by and large, are selling farm venison. Mm-hmm. Certainly Waitrose and Marks and Spencer's. Tesco, you have to look on the back because some of it's farm from New Zealand, which quality-wise would be fine. some of it's wild, some of it's processed. You don't know where it's come from, but
Okay.
when it's processed, it's probably not so important if it's chopped up in a burger or something. So yeah, buy direct if you possibly can, and if not, then just try and check that it's farmed. I mean, it is quite a shame that the word wild has a cachet that farm doesn't. You know, a lot of people who are sort of foodies and sadly a lot of journalists as well just make an automatic assumption that wild's better and farmed is bad somehow. And it's a shame because, as I pointed out earlier, the way that deer are farmed is so much more gentle, and it's better for the environment, and it's better methane and carbon dioxide production, that really they should rejoice in it.
and highly nutritious as well. So it's
very
as you
nutritious.
Said before, a very lean and saturated fat. Even compared to beef, it's much lower in terms of fat and saturated fat, and a lot of bioavailable nutrients as well, like iron. I keep saying to some of my one-to-one nutrition clients who are lacking in iron to have some venison once in a while to boost their iron levels. So it could be great.
No,
for that.
it's particularly good for iron. Yes, I think it's even, we're even allowed to say it is high in iron, but there's quite a few other goodies in there as well.
Yeah, I was looking at it before. I think it's iron and zinc and selenium and B vitamins and all sorts. So really bioavailable, so the body easily absorbs it.
To take it.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
What would you say the best way to cook it is if like somebody hadn't cooked venison before or was a venison novice and a bit nervous about using it? What's the best way for them to start off?
Well, obviously the way people like to eat meat is very varied. But for something that's going to be fairly foolproof, I would, if they like to have any sort of a stew or a casserole, then that's a very easy way to do it because it's fairly difficult to go wrong. Now, a lot of people associate venison and they think, oh, you have to marinate it. And my answer to that is no, you don't need to marinate it. If you like the flavour of meat cooked in wine, brilliant, cook it in wine. But why bother marinating it? You've just got to take all the bits out of the marinade, pat them all dry before you brown them. Just cook it in some delicious, wines and flavors and spice.
What was the thought about marinating it? Is it to get more flavor into the meat before you cook it, or to protect the meat, or why would you marinate it?
Well, exactly. Why would you marinate it? So you have to stop and think, why would I marinate this? What am I trying to achieve? I think if you look in really old cookery books, nobody marinates their venison. It was always very fresh. They didn't have any way of keeping it. They just brought it in and ate it. And nobody talks about marinades. It's not really until sort of the 19th century we start seeing those creeping in. And I think, it's only a theory and I can't prove it, but I think a lot of it's to do with Prince Albert coming over from Germany. It's a very Germanic thing to do, to put lots of fruit and wine and quite heavy spices into their foods. But that also coincided with the stalking industry, where people, instead of just going out to shoot some meat to eat, they were stalking them for different reasons. And so poorer quality venison was coming along. It would then be stuck on the train and sent to London or wherever. So it probably arrived, a little bit whiffy. So marinade could be used as a kind of mask for that. But if you think about it, let's think fish. If you take thin slices of fish and soak them in lime juice, ceviche, what happens? It sort of cooks the fish and makes it go almost furry if you leave it too long on the outside. And that's the acid in the lime juice. So why would it be any different putting wine around meat? So it doesn't make it more succulent. It's actually the reverse.
Okay.
What I like to call the eating quality of venison is made up of different things. You've got flavour, you've got smell, which is allied to that, but you've got the texture, you've got juiciness, and you've got succulence. And those are all slightly different things. The tenderness, obviously, we've talked about, that's age. And the smell is how it's handled. It should just smell so nice that you want to just pop it in your mouth raw. Juiciness is what we're talking about when we're cooking a steak or a roast, where you really don't want to cook those past the pink stage, because the juiciness is the blood in the meat. If you don't like meat that's even slightly pink, I wouldn't have a steak or a roast of venison personally. Although I do know people who will happily chomp through what to me looks like a bit of dried up bread.
So you'd have a rare steak if it's a venison, not a well done, or medium even.
I would have a medium one, medium to rare. So that's juiciness. So you don't really tend to get juiciness in a stew other than the gravy. It's not in the meat. Okay, it's in the gravy round about it. So again, with any lean meat, I say to people, if you're making a stew, don't cut the cubes too big, because if you've got a very lean meat and a big chunk of it, however delicious and the sauce round about it is, you still got quite a dry chunk of meat when you cut it. So I would make the pieces big enough not to need cutting, so that each piece has got more nice sauce surrounding it. So that's juiciness. And then quite allied to that is succulence. And succulence is that sort of slippery feeling that you get with fatty meat, which most people love. But you don't get that with venison. At least you don't get it from fat in venison. There's only one way that you can get succulence in venison, and that is from the connective tissue, which turns to a sort of jelly when it's really slowly cooked, which is why things like the shin are really nice, because they have that slipperiness that very lean meats lack. But if you're doing a stew, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can cook some aubergine with it, or carrots, or lots of onions, or mushrooms, and all those things, when they're cooked, had that sort of nice slippery texture that, along with the venison, makes it nice.
I sometimes add chocolate to my stew right at the end. Is that good?
Yeah, that's.
I read that somewhere in a good recipe.
Yeah, it's an Italian practice. Yes, that's right. And actually, I've got again in my book, there's sort of list of different flavors that you might are quite interesting to go with venison. And I've said chocolate, and if you haven't got it, just cocoa powder, actually. You can put a little bit of cocoa powder in if you haven't got any actual chocolate around. What
other flavors should I add to my stew or venison?
Well, one of the most traditional ones is juniper berries. That's what was in a classic marinade, and they are very nice. I would crush them rather than put them in whole. Any of the berries really, and currants go traditionally well. So raspberries, blackberries, red currants, black currants. If you like that sort of sweet tart sort of flavour with it, are lovely. Yeah, I mean, I sort of do a kind of raspberry sauce is delicious. Other flavours that are interesting are some of the ones that people associate with fish, actually. So fennel, bulb fennel.
Okay, never thought of that.
Just in a little sauce, goes really well with venison. And a hollandaise sauce, brilliant with a venison steak or roast.
And have you got, I know there's so many different ways to have venison, but have you got a kind of favourite or something that you just love to have?
I like to keep it really quite simple and just have it as a steak or roast, fairly unadorned, but perfectly cooked. And then some really delicious, lots and lots of really delicious vegetable dishes to go round about it. Maybe some vegetable in a sauce or other, maybe the fennel might be in a little sauce. And
a good nutritionally balanced meal.
Everything. yeah, lots and lots of vegetables to go with it. Just about roasting. Quite often recipes will call for a certain cut or a certain weight of meat. So it might say, 500 grams of venison haunch or something like that. Or it might even say 500 grams of venison loin, which is fine. But if you're getting a roe deer loin, it might be that thick. And if you were getting a wild red deer, it might be that thick.
So a variation of a couple of inches then.
Yeah, and those two pieces, although they might weigh the same, will cook completely differently. So what you want to do there is it's the thickness of the meat, not the weight of it. So you get a piece of meat, yay long, and it can cook very quickly if it's just got that profile. But you could have a piece of meat the same weight that was practically like a sphere, and it would take much, much, much longer to cook because it's so thick. So actually in my book, I actually put little measuring tapes I mean, not measure, a measure down the side of the page so people can put their...
Can measure the thickness of it.
4 centimetres.
Okay.
And then it tells them so much per centimetre rather than so much per 500 grams. That's quite important, actually, that makes sense.
Thickness, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So just to sum up, could you give us your thoughts and say what you feel the advantages of deer farming in Scotland are, and us including more venison in the diet?
Yes, I think from the farming point of view, we've got a sustainable meat here. It's the best environmentally friendly meat production that you're going to get. It's lower carbon and emissions, and as a general rule, it's got far smaller use of sort of antibiotics, drugs in general. So that's a sustainable advantage. So we're hoping that the Scottish Government will look kindly on deer farmers and include in the support, because it'd be grossly unfair to be supporting livestock farmers that produce less sustainable meat than ours. So sustainability and good for the environment is one thing. It's welfare friendly because of the way that we're farming them. As I explained before, we're working with the animals, not trying to sort of force them to do things they don't want to do. So it's welfare friendly. It's human friendly because they're comparatively easy to farm. Nothing is totally easy, of course. But once you understand the animals, then it's a nice way to farm. And then so far as the meat is concerned, we've got a meat here that is without any kind of human interference. It's very nutritious with very high levels of iron and lots of other goodies as well. It's delicious, especially when you cook it the Nichola Fletcher way. And farm venison in particular is consistent and tender, and I think that means a lot to people when they're cooking it. So it's tender, it's nutritious, it's delicious. So what's not to like about it? So definitely we should be eating more of it.
I think that has been a huge insight into deer farming and venison, and thank you for all your information. I think if you do want to learn more about cooking venison especially, I know you've done a whole range of lovely recipe books and particularly about cooking venison, so I'll include them in the show notes. Yeah, just like to say thank you once again. It's been a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure too. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this Food Connections podcast. Do check out the show notes for some useful links related to this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could give it a rating and leave a short review. It would mean so much. And please do spread the word and tell others about it. If you have any comments or suggestions for future guests, do get in touch. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.